Dust floated in the air as Richard opened an old notebook he hadn't touched in years. The cover was faded, corners bent, as if time itself had been trying to erase it. When he turned the first page, his heart sank. Every page was blank, only marked by forgotten dates written long ago. He stared at those empty lines, realizing how many promises he had made to himself and never kept. It felt less like paper and more like a mirror. He sat there in silence, surrounded by the ghosts of his own potential. Memories rushed in, ideas once alive, dreams once burning, all of them waiting for a moment that never came. Each page whispered the same cruel truth. You kept waiting for tomorrow. His chest tightened as he thought about all the mornings he wasted saying, "I'll start soon." For the first time, he understood that lost time doesn't disappear. It stays inside you, disguised as regret. He ran his fingers over the pages, feeling the weight of every undone thing pressing against his soul. This wasn't just about missed chances. It was about the slow fading of who he used to be. The younger version of himself, curious, bold, alive, felt like a stranger now. A single tear fell, leaving a mark on the blank paper, like life begging him to write again. In that fragile moment, Richard realized something powerful. He hadn't been losing days, he had been losing himself. The notebook wasn't empty by accident. It was a reflection of every dream left waiting, every goal that died in silence, every maybe tomorrow that became never. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Not anymore." If you've ever looked back and felt that same sting of regret, that ache for the time you can't get back, this story is for you. Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's written, it's what's left blank. This is the story of Richard, a man who kept waiting for the perfect time to begin. He believed that clarity would come one day, that courage would appear when everything finally felt right. But that day never came. Instead, life quietly slipped by in the background of routines, unfinished dreams, and invisible fears, until one forgotten notebook brought him face to face with the truth he had been avoiding. That night, staring at those blank pages, Richard realized that regret doesn't arrive suddenly. It builds slowly, moment by moment, every time you say not today. He wasn't lazy or unmotivated. He was afraid of failing, of being seen trying, of not being enough. But fear disguised itself as patience, and patience turned into paralysis. We often think we're waiting for the right moment, but the truth is, moments don't wait for us. They pass quietly, without asking permission. Richard's story matters because it's not just his, it's ours. It's the quiet ache in every person who once believed they had more time. The illusion that tomorrow will somehow fix what today neglects. When he found that notebook, something shifted. It wasn't just paper. It was proof that he still had a choice. The story that follows isn't about success or failure. It's about reclaiming authorship of your life. One line, one choice, one page at a time. Because healing doesn't begin when everything is perfect. It begins when you dare to start, even imperfectly. Before we begin, take this as a small sign, a reminder that your next chapter could start right now. So if stories like this stir something in you, subscribe and stay with us until the end. Because every story here is a mirror reflecting the truth that it's never too late to start again. For a long moment, Richard just stared at the empty page. The pen felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of every unfinished plan he'd ever made. His mind raced. What if I fail again? What if I start and give up halfway? But then another thought surfaced, quieter, yet stronger. What if this time I don't? That tiny whisper felt like hope disguised as courage. His hand trembled slightly as the pen touched the paper. He didn't overthink it, didn't plan it. He just wrote one word: begin. The ink bled softly into the page, like a heartbeat finally returning after years of silence. He stared at the word for a long time, feeling something shift inside. It wasn't fireworks. It was peace. Fragile, but real. For the first time in years, he felt alive. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about that single word: begin. It echoed in his mind like a gentle command from something greater than himself. He lay in bed with a strange lightness, the kind that comes after releasing a secret you've carried too long. He whispered to the dark, maybe it's not too late. Maybe it never was. For the first time, sleep felt like rest, not escape. The next morning, Richard woke earlier than usual. He made coffee, sat by the window, and opened the notebook again. This time, he didn't write plans or resolutions. He wrote a memory. Something simple, raw, and true. The words flowed without judgment. Regret began melting into reflection. Reflection began turning into motion. It was as if his soul had found its rhythm again. And yet, deep inside, he sensed this was only the beginning. The page had been conquered, but the real battle was still waiting. The one that lived inside his habits, his fears, his own mind. Because writing was easy, but living what he wrote, that would be the test. The next week came like a wave crashing back to shore. Richard tried to hold on to that spark from the night he wrote "Begin," but life moved fast, too fast. Work deadlines, endless notifications, the noise of routine, it all started pulling him back into the same rhythm he swore he'd escape. Each day the voice of inspiration grew fainter, drowned by the hum of normal life. By Thursday, he hadn't written a single word. The notebook sat on his desk, half buried under papers and unopened mail. He'd glance at it sometimes, feel guilt stab his chest, then distract himself with something meaningless. "You're the same as before," a whisper in his mind taunted. "You always start strong and fade away." He hated how familiar that voice sounded. It wasn't the world mocking him, it was himself. That Friday night, he sat in his car after work, staring at the city lights. Everyone seemed to be moving, laughing, living, doing, and there he was stuck again between who he was and who he wanted to be. He slammed his hand against the steering wheel, frustration spilling out in silence. "Why do I keep doing this to myself?" he whispered. No answer came, just the faint ache of disappointment that felt like déjà vu. When he got home, the notebook was waiting, quiet, patient, accusing. He almost shoved it back into the drawer, but something stopped him. The fear of another blank page, the fear of losing another year. He sat down, opened it, and stared at his own handwriting. "Begin." For a second, his heart steadied. He realized the battle wasn't against time or failure, it was against surrender. That night, as he forced himself to write again, something shifted. The words came out raw, uneven, angry, but they came. "I won't waste another chance," he scribbled. His handwriting shook, but his spirit didn't. He didn't know it yet, but this resistance, this fight with himself, was the very proof that he was changing. And soon, a stranger would enter his story and push that change even deeper. It was a quiet evening in early spring. The air smelled faintly of rain, and Richard walked to the nearby park with his notebook in hand, hoping movement might untangle his thoughts. He sat on a wooden bench under a flickering lamppost, watching the world move around him. Joggers, couples, children laughing. Everyone seemed to be living forward, while he still felt stuck replaying the past. He opened his notebook but couldn't write. The page stared back at him, blank and unbothered, as if it dared him to try again. He sighed, rubbing his forehead, muttering under his breath, "What's the point?" That's when an older man, sitting a few feet away, spoke without even looking at him. "Are you writing your future or your excuses?" He froze, unsure if he'd heard right. The stranger turned his head slightly. Kind eyes, weathered face, the kind of presence that carried quiet authority. "I used to keep a notebook like that," he said, tapping his cane softly on the ground. "But I filled it with what-ifs, not actions. Regret doesn't come from failing, son. It comes from silence." His voice was calm but heavy, as if it came from a place of deep knowing. Richard wanted to respond but couldn't. He felt exposed, as if this man could see every missed opportunity, every dream he had buried under hesitation. The old man stood to leave, smiling faintly. "You don't need to write perfect pages, just honest ones." Then, without waiting for a reply, he walked away slowly, disappearing into the mist that hung over the path. Richard sat there for a long time, heart pounding. The man's words echoed inside him like a bell that refused to stop ringing. Regret doesn't come from failure. It comes from silence. He looked down at the notebook in his lap, at the blank page, staring back. That night he made a promise. No more empty days. No more blank pages. From now on, one page. Every day. No matter what. For years, Richard had carried a quiet dream to open a small photography studio. Not for fame, not for money, but because capturing life had always made him feel alive. His camera sat on the shelf collecting dust, much like that old notebook once did. Every time he looked at it, he'd whisper the same excuse, "When I have more time." But now, as the pages of his notebook began to fill, those excuses started to sound weaker. Each morning, he wrote about the kind of studio he wanted. The smell of coffee in the corner, walls covered in stories told through portraits, the soft click of the shutter echoing like a heartbeat. At first, they were just words, but as he kept writing, the dream stopped feeling distant. It became a blueprint, then a commitment. He didn't need to figure it all out, he just needed to start. Soon he began taking small steps, cleaning his old camera, reaching out to a friend who owned a cafe to display a few photos, saving a little from each paycheck. None of it was grand, but it was movement. And movement felt sacred. Each step gave him something he hadn't felt in years: momentum. His notebook wasn't just a diary anymore. It had become a map, leading him back to himself. Weeks passed. The notebook grew heavier, filled with sketches, ideas, and reflections. His photos began to change too, more intentional, more alive. People noticed. A friend called his pictures quiet poems, and for the first time, Richard didn't deflect the compliment. He smiled, because he knew The dream wasn't waiting for someday anymore. It was unfolding, one line, one photo, one breath at a time. It happened on a Thursday morning. Richard arrived at work, coffee in hand, mind still buzzing with new ideas for his photography studio. But before he could even sit down, his manager called him into the office, eyes heavy, tone rehearsed. The company was downsizing. His position was gone. Just like that, 5 years of routine vanished in a 3-minute conversation. The coffee went cold before he even touched it. He walked home under a gray sky, the world around him blurred and distant. Every step echoed with questions he couldn't answer. Why now? Why when I was finally trying? The weight of irony was cruel. He had just begun to believe again, and life had pulled the ground from under him. By the time he reached his apartment, silence felt heavier than grief. The camera on his desk stared back at him, almost mocking. The notebook lay open to yesterday's entry. Tomorrow I'll buy new lighting equipment. His throat tightened. He slammed the notebook shut, anger spilling through his fingers. "What's the point?" he muttered, pacing the room. Old thoughts began creeping in. The familiar whispers. "See, you were foolish to hope." And for a moment he almost believed them. Then something made him stop. A small corner of the notebook had bent, where the page folded, revealing a line from weeks earlier. "I will not stop because life does." He had written that sentence himself, on a night much like this one, uncertain, tired, afraid. The words hit differently now. They weren't just ink on paper. They were a message from his past self, a hand reaching through time to pull him back up. Tears blurred his vision, but this time they didn't feel like defeat. They felt like release. He opened the notebook again, breathing shakily, and wrote, "This is not the end. It's a redirection." The pain didn't disappear, but his will hardened around it. Because maybe life wasn't testing his strength. Maybe it was asking if he truly meant what he wrote. And Richard did. Months passed. Richard didn't rush to find another job. Instead, he poured his days into his notebook and his camera. What began as a small act of defiance became a rhythm of creation. He took photos of everything: the cracked sidewalks, the tired eyes of commuters, the golden light that touched ordinary faces. He began posting them online with short reflections taken from his journal. To his surprise, people started responding. Messages flooded in, strangers saying his words made them feel less alone, that his photos helped them see beauty in their own routines. What once felt like loss now felt like redirection. His small dream, the one buried for years under fear and self-doubt, was slowly taking shape in the open. He rented a modest space downtown, filled it with light, and called it the second beginning. Standing in that little studio for the first time, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years, not pride, but peace. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong or chasing success. It was about keeping a promise to himself. Every photo on the wall told a story of perseverance, of small starts and quiet courage. Each one was a page brought to life, fragments of a man who decided to write again when silence tried to win. One evening, as he locked up the studio, he noticed the old notebook resting by the window. The last page was full. He smiled softly and wrote his final line, "I didn't rewrite my past. I began my future." The ink dried slowly, catching the glow of sunset. He closed the notebook gently, no longer afraid of endings, because he had finally learned that every ending, when faced with courage, becomes the beginning of something greater. Outside, the city buzzed with life, unaware of his quiet victory. But Richard knew he didn't need the world to see it. The change was already written, not just in words, but in who he had become. And maybe so is yours. My friend, Maybe you also have your own notebook, not made of paper, but of memories, plans, and unfinished dreams. Maybe there's something inside you that still waits for the perfect moment, but the truth is, there's not perfect time to start again. Only this one, the one you're living right now. Every second you breathe is a page waiting to be written. Regret will always whisper, "You could have done more." But faith whispers something softer. You still can. The difference between who you were and who you can become begins with one small decision, one word, one action, the same kind that changed Richard's life forever. You don't need to fix the past, you just need to start writing again. So, today, don't let your dreams stay folded in the corners of your heart. Open them. Let them breathe. Begin the thing you've been postponing, the call, the letter, the idea, the prayer. Don't let fear convince you that blank pages mean failure. They mean possibility. The story isn't over unless you stop writing it. So if this story touched you, if it felt like a mirror reflecting your own life, don't leave without doing one small thing. Subscribe for more stories that awaken your soul. Because every day a new story here reminds us that broken beginnings can still lead to beautiful endings. That no matter how far you've drifted, grace still leaves the light on for your return. Now, take a deep breath, open your notebook, whatever that means for you, and write your next line. And in the comments, declare it out loud. I'm starting my next page today. Because one day, someone else will read your story and realize that their tomorrow can start right now.